It took a single sentence at a wedding to undo 30 years of silence. I remember the ballroom in Charleston that October evening, 2018, like it's etched into my chest. The scent of lilies mingled with expensive cologne, the kind of fragrance you can feel in your sinuses long after you leave. Chandeliers dripped light onto polished oak floors, reflecting off the satin gowns and tuxedos. I stood there in a rented suit that swallowed me at the shoulders, my hands gripping the edges of my jacket as if it could anchor me against the tide of wealth and expectation that washed over the room. My daughter Marissa was radiant, a beacon in champagne silk. Her smile was effortless, the kind that made you forget your own scars for a heartbeat. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Evan Crayton, the groom, took the microphone with that polished, practiced ease that made people trust him instantly. 33 years old, charming, poised, he could have sold ice to a snowman. To my father-in-law, he said, and I felt the room tilt. I already knew the kind of sentence he was about to deliver. Those rehearsed weddings always hide a sting, but I didn't leave. My throat tightened as he continued. The most annoying beggar I've ever met. Laughter rolled through the ballroom like a wave, eager and loud. Guests who had never met me before chuckled. Some politely, some cruelly. My jaw went rigid, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I looked for Marissa, half expecting horror in her eyes, but she was frozen in shock, the glass trembling in her hand. My heart ached, not for me, but for her, caught in the middle of a war she didn't yet understand. Then I saw her, Lydia Crayton, Evan's mother. Her fork hovered over her plate, her smile frozen. 30 years of memory swept over me. I remembered the spring of 1991, a house on East Bay Street, the deed under my hand, a younger me, a younger her, and the promises that never got their chance to breathe. She had known me then. She remembered me now, but she was caught, like a bird in a net, staring at the man her son had become, the polished mask that hid a reckless greed and a bank slip of $699,842 buried somewhere in his office. I didn't move. I didn't defend. I let the words fall like stones into a pond, watching the ripples they made. Laughter and champagne bubbles swirled, but in that moment the room became a courtroom, a stage, and a battlefield all at once. Outside in the cool evening, the low hum of Charleston streetlights made me pause. I heard Evan laughing with a friend, his voice carrying through the open doors. "We'll have the house by Christmas," he said, as though it were already his, as though it were ever his to take. I felt my hand tighten around the brass key in my pocket. The house, it wasn't just walls and timber. It was decades of work, love, and sacrifice. It was my wife's laughter, my daughter's first steps, and my proof that I had built something lasting in a world that often left men like me behind. They thought my silence meant surrender. It never had, not then, not ever. Later, in the quiet of my car, I pulled the brass key from my pocket and turned it slowly between my fingers. The grooves were worn smooth, each one a memory. I could feel the weight of every hammer stroke, every nail, every morning spent watching beams rise under my hands. This key wasn't just access, it was ownership, proof, legacy, and no words at a wedding could erase that. I remember Marissa tugging at my sleeve, whispering, "Dad, are you okay?" I nodded, but it was a small nod, the kind that doesn't speak much. Because I wasn't okay. I was fueled. A slow burn kind of fury, not of anger, but of precision. The sort that grows quietly, waiting for the right moment to turn everything into balance. Even as guests clinked glasses and the band played the soft strains of a jazz standard, I made a mental inventory. I counted the stakes, my home valued at $1.2 million, the debts of the Craytons hidden like snakes in silk pockets, and the bridge of years that Lydia had left unspoken between us. Everything in that room had a price, and not all of it was money. The emotional ledger was heavier. Evan's charm dazzled the crowd, but I could see through the veneer, every polite bow and smile a distraction from the man who thought he could erase the past with words. I walked the perimeter of the ballroom once the speeches were over, letting my eyes scan, committing every face to memory, every whisper that escaped behind tightly pressed lips. Evan thought this was a victory, that a sentence spoken aloud could reduce a lifetime of building into embarrassment. He didn't understand that silence is a shield, patience a weapon, and that legacy isn't measured by a toast or a laugh. That night, back at my own home, I laid the brass key on the kitchen table, right next to the stack of documents I kept for emergencies: deed, receipts, tax forms, the careful record of every mortgage payment ever made. I slid my finger over the worn brass, feeling the edges, the weight, the permanence. I wasn't planning revenge yet, not tonight, but I was planting the seed, turning humiliation into strategy, betrayal into fuel. And as I closed the door behind me, the house breathed in the night, quiet and resilient. The walls knew what I knew. They weren't just shelter, they were proof. They were proof that even when laughter tries to break you, silence, patience, and preparation can hold you upright. By the end of that night, I understood one thing clearly. The wedding didn't just humiliate me. It awakened something that 30 years of silence had been preparing for, and they had no idea what they had just started. 2 weeks after that wedding, Charleston was gray and restless. Rain tapped against the tin roof like a slow metronome, each drop a reminder that storms come whether you're ready or not. The kind of rain that doesn't just soak your clothes, it seeps into your bones. I walked the halls I had built with my own hands, the same floors that had echoed with my wife's laughter and Marissa's first footsteps. The house was quiet, so quiet, it felt like it had been holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. I found an envelope on the porch, glossy and impersonal, the kind of thing meant to startle. My property, the one I had poured 30 years into, was circled in red on a real estate flyer. On the back, a single message: "This will be ours by Christmas." 3 words scrawled in haste, and yet they carried the weight of threat, entitlement, and hubris. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and studied it as if it were a map of the battlefield I was only beginning to see. I tried calling Evan. No answer. Not once. Not twice. The voicemail left me feeling small in a room that was otherwise mine. Marissa's voice, when I finally reached her, sounded distant, soft, careful, like she was trying not to pick a side yet. "Dad, I'll call you later," she said, and the line went dead. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I understood the pull of loyalty and love tangled up in fear and confusion. I moved through the room slowly. Each beam, each window frame, each scratch on the hardwood whispered memories back to me. The study where my wife had taught Marissa to read, the dining room where we celebrated small victories. Every inch was a testament to patience, to work, to life built from scratch. And now it was threatened by someone who didn't even understand the cost of a home beyond a price tag. I stopped at the kitchen table, ran my fingers over the brass key I had clutched at the wedding. Its weight was reassuring, tangible, a small anchor in the flood of anxiety. The deeds and mortgage papers beneath it reminded me that I wasn't defenseless. Every payment recorded, every signed document filed, every legal safeguard I had ever put in place was my shield, even if it wasn't immediately obvious to the rest of the world. That night, I sat in the living room, listening to the rain drumming a slow rhythm on the roof. I thought about Evan and his words at the wedding, about that casual entitlement, the assumption that my decades of labor and love could be claimed by a single polished sentence. He didn't understand, and that was his mistake. I knew patience. I knew preparation. I knew that power isn't loud. It's quiet, relentless, accumulating while the world is distracted. I went through my ledgers and files, checking balances, reviewing the chain of payments, confirming the mortgage, and noting the timing of every loan. The $1.2 million property wasn't just numbers on paper. It was proof that I had built something real. Proof that their words, their laughter, and their threats were meaningless if I remained vigilant. Marissa appeared briefly in the doorway that evening, her eyes downcast. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She was watching, learning, seeing her father not as a victim, but as a man who refused to surrender. I could feel her heartbeat in the silence between us, tentative, uncertain, but present. I nodded at her once, a small affirmation that we would endure, that I wasn't about to crumble. The next morning, I noticed something else. Evan had left a bank slip on the porch, careless, almost deliberate, as if to remind me of the debt he carried and hoped I would fear. $699,842, rolled twice, growing quietly like a shadow over his polished image. I slipped it into my drawer and underlined the date October 19th, 2018. Evidence, small and inconspicuous, but irrefutable. Every number mattered. Every signature mattered. Every slip of paper could be turned into armor if used wisely. I changed the locks that week. Twice. One set for the main house, one for the guest cottage. Each key carefully catalogued, not out of paranoia, out of necessity. Trust is a fragile thing when a man with a polished smile believes entitlement is a birthright, and I wasn't about to let him dictate the terms of my life with charm and arrogance. That weekend, I walked the property perimeter in the drizzle. The garden beds my wife and I had planted, the oak tree we had watched grow alongside Marissa, the fences I had built myself. They all held quiet testimony. I touched each corner of the house, each nail driven in by my own hands, and I felt the weight of history. This was more than home. This was legacy, and no circle drawn in red marker could erase that. By the end of the week, I had organized a folder, documents, receipts, correspondence, bank slips, and my notes. I labeled everything meticulously. Maggie, my paralegal confidant, would have a copy. The safe would hold the originals. Every piece of evidence, every ledger entry, every small detail of the house's history was cataloged and accounted for. If Evan thought he could threaten me with words and charm, he hadn't counted on preparation, on patience, or on the quiet strength of someone who knows what's theirs. By right, not by inheritance or entitlement. And so the house settled into silence again. Rain falling on tin floors creaking under its own memory, the air thick with anticipation. The echo in an empty house can be deafening if you listen closely. It carries warnings, lessons, and the quiet promise that those who underestimate it will one day pay the price. Winter arrived early in Charleston that year, 2018. The air was sharp, carrying the tang of salt from the harbor and the occasional smoke of a distant fireplace. I sat in the corner booth of a diner on Broad Street, the kind of place where the linoleum cracked and the coffee tasted like history, not marketing. Across from me, Maggie slid the deed across the table. Her hands were steady, precise, the fingers of someone who understood the weight of what she was passing. "They can't touch this without help from inside," she said quietly, almost conversationally. I nodded, keeping my voice low. "I know." The document felt heavier than any hammer I had ever lifted. A simple piece of paper on the surface, but beneath it, decades of effort, sweat, and promises. I traced the edges with my thumb, noting the embossing on the corners, the official seal. $1.2 million tied up not just in property, but in proof that no wedding toast, no polished smile, no circle drawn in red could touch it. The deed was mine, secured under law, and yet the threat still lingered like winter fog in the streets outside. A week later, Frank arrived. My old friend from construction, private investigator when needed, man of patience and discretion. He handed me a bank slip, crisp and official. The numbers stark against the white background, $699,842 in debt, rolled over twice, interest accumulating quietly like a wound under silk. I slipped it into the folder with the deed, underlining the dates, November 2nd, 2018, the second rollover. Evidence matters, even when it's small, even when it hides behind charm and expensive suits. That night, I backed up every document twice. One copy went to Maggie, carefully cataloged, cross-referenced, and labeled. The originals went into my safe, the one in the study hidden behind panels I had built myself. I caught my reflection in the polished metal door of the safe, and for the first time since the wedding, I didn't look like a guest, a visitor, a man trying to prove himself in someone else's hall. I looked like a man preparing for a siege, a quiet, methodical siege. I spent the evenings walking through the house, one hand on the railings, one on the key that weighed so heavily in my pocket. My daughter's laughter, echoes of my wife's gentle scolding, memories of weekends spent in construction dust. They all pressed into the walls like witnesses. Each step reminded me that this wasn't just real estate. It was home. It was history. It was mine, legally, morally, irrevocably. On December 3rd, I began cataloging the minor discrepancies I had noticed in the Crayton's filings over the years. Maggie had access to the county registry, and we noted every lien, every hidden clause that could expose a weakness in their claim if it ever came to court. Preparation is patience stretched into precision. I listed every irregularity in a ledger, noting page numbers, official stamps, and signatures. My handwriting filled the margins. Cross-check February 2021. Rollover verify bridge loan claim. Confirm witness signatures on deed. Each note was a bullet in a magazine no one else could see. Evenings were spent in the study with a single lamp, the glow bouncing off the wooden walls and the papers spread across the desk. I took a photograph of every document, every receipt, every bank slip, stored on encrypted drives, one at home, one in Maggie's office. Copies, backups, safety nets. The strategy was simple: accumulate proof, prepare quietly, and never make a sound until the moment was right. Evan had rushed into the wedding with bravado. I would wait, silent and deliberate, until every move he made could be countered with facts, law, and unassailable evidence. I called Marissa one evening. Her voice was soft, cautious, carrying that mixture of love and fear. "Dad, are you really going to fight him?" I paused, letting the warmth of the phone line anchor me. "Yes," I said finally. "But we fight with law, not rage. We fight with preparation, not impulsive fire. That's how this ends clean." She didn't argue. She never argued. Instead, I could hear the weight of her understanding, and it made my chest tighten. She was beginning to see that patience and evidence mattered more than anger, more than words at a wedding. I walked the perimeter of the property in the cold December nights, the air biting, the soil damp from rain that had washed the streets clean. My gloves were worn from work, hands steady. I touched the fence posts, the oak beams, the foundation walls. These were tangible proofs of decades spent building, not borrowing. Each stroke of my hand reminded me, this is mine. Each breath fogging in the winter air reminded me, patience is power. One Friday, I reviewed the deed and bank slip together at the kitchen table. I cross-referenced names, dates, and signatures, marking everything with precise notation. If Evan thought he could manipulate documents or charm his way into possession, he hadn't counted on the quiet thoroughness of a man who had survived loss and humiliation alike. $699,842 in debt, $1.2 million in property, and 3 decades of unbroken work. It was a simple arithmetic of power when combined with preparation. By Christmas Eve, I had finalized the evidence dossier. Maggie had her copy. Mine was locked securely. Frank had his notes cross-checked and verified. I stood in the living room, looking at the worn wooden beams, at the kitchen where Marissa had once learned to bake cookies, at the rooms that had echoed with life and love. The house had absorbed 30 years of my energy and integrity. Now it was ready to hold my patience, my strategy, and my quiet threat. And as the snow or the rare Charleston frost settled that night, I felt the weight of anticipation. The quiet before the counterstrike is always heavier than the storm itself. You can hear it in the floorboards, smell it in the air, feel it pressing against your chest. The Craytons had made their move. I had mine. And the difference between a man who blunders and a man who waits is what defines victory. The house whispered back to me in the empty rooms. It knew I would not surrender. It knew that the brass key, the deeds, the ledgers, and the encrypted backups were more than evidence. They were a promise. Evan thought he had started a war with a sentence at a wedding. He had no idea the war had been preparing itself quietly for years, and that now the quiet before the counterstrike had arrived. It was February 2019, and Charleston's winter carried a chill that clung to your collar and lingered in your bones. I arrived at Riverside Cafe at precisely 9:15 a.m., the kind of place where the river view made even a gray morning seem deliberate, intentional. I was early, as always, notebook in hand, eyes scanning for details, light, shadows, the reflection of faces in glass. And then I saw her. Lydia Crayton, 60 years old now, impeccably dressed, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a life built on brittle silence. She didn't set order. She just sat, the chairs scraping lightly against the floor, and whispered, "I never told him who you were, but I told him about the house." The words hung in the air, sharp, precise. I didn't move. I didn't speak. 30 years had passed, And in that moment, everything she had hidden and left unspoken pressed down on us like the weight of winter clouds over the Ashley River. I remembered 1991 vividly. The spring we had dreamed of marriage, the house on East Bay Street that had been ours, the deed she once touched with her fingers, the plans abandoned for wealth, for status, for a life that wasn't ours. I never meant for him to know, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I thought if I kept quiet you would understand, and he would never interfere. Her hands reached toward mine across the table. I pulled back slightly. Not in anger, not in spite, but in measure. I had spent decades learning that some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt simply with words. She confessed to me what she had hidden from the world, how she had planned to marry me, how she had imagined a life within the walls of my house, a life built on labor, love, and shared ambition. And then she had left, choosing someone wealthier, someone polished, someone who would carry a name instead of working for it. And now her son, Evan, the polished, smiling veneer of privilege, planned to claim what she had abandoned, what I had protected all these years. I observed her, the way her shoulders slumped, despite the designer coat she wore, the way her lips pressed together as if words alone could mend guilt, as if silence had been armor rather than a prison. "I'm sorry, Lucian," she said softly. "I thought it would never reach this. I thought I was protecting you both." I shook my head. Not at her, but at the inevitability of truth. 30 years ago she had abandoned me for wealth. Today she still carried her regret in silence, and now her son threatened to repeat the same mistakes she had made. "Lydia," I said finally, voice low and deliberate, "you're not protecting anyone. You're preserving a fantasy." She flinched, the cafe's ambient hum filling the spaces between words. The barista poured coffee, unaware of the tension that could have split the river in two. Outside, the Ashley flowed gray and cold, mirroring the weight pressing down on us. And in that moment I understood the depth of her betrayal, not just to me, but to the house, to the legacy we had built, to the truth that could have prevented all of this. "I don't expect forgiveness," she whispered. "But I thought if I told you now, maybe you'd—" She trailed off. Maybe she hoped I would relent. Maybe she hoped I would soften. Maybe she thought I would see her confession as absolution. I didn't. I understood her intention. But the time for absolution had passed. I stood up, carefully, keeping my composure. The table was quiet, except for the clink of her spoon against the ceramic cup. "You gave him everything you withheld from me," I said. "You gave him permission to think this house, this life, could be taken with words and charm. I once said, allow it." Her hands rested on the table, tense. She wanted to reach again, but I didn't offer mine. 30 years of absence, betrayal, and silence had taught me that some gestures, some reconciliations arrived too late. The apology was hers. The consequence was inevitable. I left the cafe, winter wind biting at my cheeks, the river glinting coldly under the gray sky. I could feel her watching me, wishing perhaps that history could reverse itself, but I had already accounted for history, for betrayal, for greed. I had catalogued, documented, backed up, and prepared. And in that preparation, I held power she had abandoned decades ago. Walking back to the house, I reflected on the threads of the past. Lydia's confession wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation of what I already knew, that the Craytons' polished exterior hid rot, that greed had been in their blood for decades, and that silence had been my most potent ally. The house would remain mine. The evidence would remain intact, and the storm they thought they could unleash would be weathered with deliberate calm. That evening I placed the documents from Maggie and Frank carefully in my safe, the same safe I had lined with copies, backups, and secure ledgers. Deed, receipts, bank slips, bridge loan notes, all cataloged, cross-referenced, secured. The house had become more than walls and beams. It was a vault of memory, truth, and justice. I thought about Marissa, about the lessons she would learn as she watched her father prepare for the battle ahead without ever raising his voice. Revenge, I reflected, isn't rage, it isn't chaos. It's patience, precision, and preparation. Every receipt, every signature, every document lined up like soldiers ready for the signal. By the time I went to bed, Charleston was quiet, under a thin frost. The streetlights reflected on the damp pavement. Lydia's confession had shifted nothing materially, but it had crystallized the stakes. I would no longer rely on silence alone, but on a strategy built with evidence, law, and unyielding patience. The counterstrike was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent, deliberate, and inevitable. As I closed my eyes, I whispered to myself, some doors once closed remain closed, and some betrayals, once revealed, demand accountability. The past had spoken. Now the future would answer. Spring of 2019 arrived with a deceptive warmth in Charleston, the kind that tricks you into thinking life is gentle before reality snaps its teeth. Evan started moving openly, though he thought subtlety would protect him. Lawyers calling at odd hours, sweet words to Marissa, the slow, steady drumbeat of manipulation designed to unsettle me without leaving obvious traces. It was all too predictable, a polished performance masking a man desperate to seize a house that wasn't his, to claim a legacy that never belonged to him. I moved faster. Careful, measured, deliberate. The first step was securing what had always been mine. With Maggie at my side, we transferred the house into an irrevocable trust. She was co-trustee, precise and loyal. The legal documents were executed on March 12th, notarized and filed, copies safely tucked away with duplicates held by both of us. One glance at the papers and you could see the foundation of a shield, irreversible, formidable, and unseen. Frank came through the next week with a discovery that made my pulse tighten in satisfaction and apprehension simultaneously, a forged bridge loan application using my address. Someone had tried to create the illusion of my consent, to manufacture permission where none existed. The document was clever, polished, but errors always betray themselves. The signature slightly off, the date misaligned. I photographed it, filed it, and placed it in my growing dossier. The evidence of deceit, once uncovered, becomes a weapon if handled with care. I spent one evening on the porch, folder in hand, staring out at the garden beds my wife had planted, at the oak that had grown with Marissa, at the beams that had heard our laughter and our plans. For a moment, just a single fleeting second, I considered it. One illegal move. A forged signature back at him. A trap that would strike without law, without caution. I imagined the look on his face when the house, the legal fortress, crumbled beneath him. I felt the intoxicating pull of immediate satisfaction. Then I breathed. Slow, deliberate, grounding myself. Revenge is meaningless if it requires becoming the very thing you despise. Crossing that line would make me no different from Evan, no different from the Craytons who had cultivated deceit and entitlement for decades. Clean hands, law-abiding strategy, that was the path. That was the victory that mattered. I placed the folder back in the safe, feeling the metal door click shut like a drum signaling readiness. The papers inside, deed, trust transfer, the forged loan, bank slips, correspondence were more than documents. They were a map, a plan, a blueprint for justice. Maggie would maintain her copy, Frank had his notes, and I kept the originals, locked and catalogued. Every step taken was deliberate, measured, every detail accounted for. Evan might charm, manipulate, and bluff, but the house, the law, and the evidence were on my side. Marissa watched quietly from the doorway that night. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She understood instinctively that the quiet hours in which I prepared, catalogued, and fortified weren't idle. They were the movements of a man building a trap with patience, not malice. I nodded at her once, and her eyes, hesitant, searching, reflected comprehension. She began to see that her father's power wasn't in shouting, it was in planning. That night she lingered longer than usual before retreating, a subtle affirmation of loyalty without words. The days that followed were methodical. I reviewed every document, every note, cross-referenced dates, signatures, and ledger entries. The bridge loan application went through my fingers repeatedly, examined for discrepancies, traced to its origin. Frank continued to investigate quietly, tracking every minor misstep Evan had left in his wake. Calls, emails, receipts, transactions, all catalogued in preparation for the inevitable confrontation. One evening the rain returned, drumming against the roof with insistent rhythm. I stood at the kitchen window, brass key in hand, looking out at the street. The house was quiet, steadfast, absorbing the storm without complaint. I thought about the Craytons, about Evan's arrogance, about the casual confidence he had shown at the wedding. He believed entitlement, charm, and intimidation were sufficient weapons. He didn't know the quiet, the methodical preparation, the legal fortress being built behind closed doors. I arranged a folder on the kitchen table that evening, the documents layered with care, 1991 deed on top. The trust transfer underneath, followed by the forged loan, bank slips, and Frank's notes. The order mattered. Presentation mattered. Evidence isn't merely evidence. It's a narrative, a story of deception exposed, and when the time came, it would tell itself. As night fell, I lit a single lamp in the study, the glow reflecting off polished wooden beams, casting long shadows across the room. I reviewed the chronology again. Wedding insult October 2018. Trust transfer March 2019. Bridge loan discovery April 2019. Each date, each action, each preparation was a stitch in a tapestry that Evan could not unravel. I could almost hear the gears of inevitability turning quietly, invisibly, while the world assumed chaos reigned. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt the satisfaction of strategy rather than impulse. The trap was set, not with malice, not with rage, but with law, patience, and undeniable proof. The first strike would be subtle, surgical, and unassailable. Evan's every attempt at manipulation, every smile and entreaty had been catalogued, accounted for, and neutralized in advance. I lay awake briefly, listening to the rain on the roof, the house breathing around me, each creak of timber a reminder that it had been built to endure. Revenge, I reflected, isn't about rage, it's about control, precision, and timing. The first trap wasn't about destroying Evan. It was about protecting what was mine and demonstrating that entitlement, charm, and greed could not outweigh preparation, law, and patience. And as the night deepened, I understood clearly Evan had opened the door with his arrogance, but it would be I who decided when it closed. The first trap was not vengeance in its raw form. It was justice in waiting. 2020 bled into 2021 with Charleston wrapped in a long, relentless summer. The city streets were hot, the air thick with humidity, but the tension in the Crayton household was even more stifling, hidden behind charm and charity galas. Evan's public persona was flawless, smiling, polite, admired at every social event, but the veneer was cracking, and I could see it. 2 loan rollovers had swelled his debt quietly to $699,842, numbers that whispered of desperation even when he laughed in public. Behind polished speeches and staged generosity, there was panic, miscalculation, and the slow erosion of credibility. I visited the house one afternoon in early July, checking locks, reviewing ledgers, and surveying the property as if it were both battlefield and sanctuary. Marissa appeared at the doorway, her arms crossed, hesitation etched into her posture. "Dad, if I'd asked you to help him, would you have?" she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of doubt, of love, and of a child still seeing both men in her life as pillars of trust. I didn't lie. "I never have." "No," I said simply. The words hung between us like summer heat, heavy and undeniable. She looked away, tears glimmering, but there was clarity forming in her eyes, a spark of understanding. She was beginning to see the truth behind charm, the evidence behind smiles, the shadow behind wealth. She had watched her father prepare quietly, meticulously, for months, and now she could recognize strategy when it manifested. Evan had begun making his Christmas surprise moves in private, calls to lawyers, attempts to sway Marissa, hints of his intentions at brunch and family gatherings. Each effort was catalogued, noted, and stored. I had photographs, copies of letters, recordings, and bank slips, all securely filed and cross-referenced. The $1.2 million property, the deed, the trust documents, the forged bridge loan discovery, they were all lined up like soldiers, waiting for the moment they would be deployed. The Crayton's golden facade faltered further when I attended a local charity event in September. Lydia's smile never reached her eyes in the photographs later printed in the Charleston Daily. The crowd admired her elegance, her refinement, but I saw exhaustion, guilt, the subtle tremor of a woman who had left a man she once loved, and now watched her son attempt to reclaim what he had no right to. That smile in the paper, for all its polish, betrayed the cracks I had known existed since the wedding insult. One evening I sat on the porch with my folder, reviewing everything: the deed, the irrevocable trust, the forged loan application, bank slips, Frank's investigative notes, Maggie's affidavit drafts. I ran a careful cross-check on the dates and signatures, noting the smallest discrepancies. Every minor detail mattered. Evan's every maneuver, every attempt to manipulate, had been catalogued. Every document was a chess piece in a game he didn't realize he was already losing. Marissa stayed longer than usual that evening, lingering in the doorway like she did when she was a child, hesitant yet present. Dad, he won't see it coming, will he?" she asked softly. I didn't answer immediately because preparation is more powerful than words. I let her watch me review the evidence, observe the careful strategy in place. Then I said, "No, but it's not about surprise. It's about justice, clarity, and inevitability. He can't charm, bribe, or intimidate his way out of what's already set in motion." As December approached, the quiet tension in Charleston mirrored the atmosphere inside my home. I slid the forged loan document into my palm during a routine check one morning. For a heartbeat, Evan's breakfast threat from 2018 flickered in my memory. "You'll give me that house, old man." I pressed it into the folder, letting the irony settle. Years of careful documentation had transformed his words into proof, his threats into evidence. The hunter had become the prey, and he didn't yet know it. That night I drafted the invitation text. December 22nd, dinner, bring your family. It was simple, deliberate, and contained all the subtle control a man needs when he has set the board in his favor. The date was precise. The place was mine. The presence of every document, every witness, and every prepared copy of evidence meant that when the night arrived, nothing would be left to chance. The house itself seemed to anticipate the event, the walls holding the memory of decades of effort and care. The oak beams, the floors that had carried laughter and sorrow alike, the windows that had seen both joy and betrayal. They absorbed the preparation, the strategy, and the weight of inevitability. This was no longer just a house. It was a stronghold, a vault, and a stage for the final act of this silent drama. I reviewed my ledger one last time before locking the safe deed, irrevocable trust documents, forged loan application, bank slips, notes, copies for Maggie, Frank's investigative records. Everything was cataloged and cross-checked. No detail could escape notice. Every piece of evidence had been verified and stored. This was precision built over months, a plan executed in silence, a trap poised to transform arrogance into accountability. As I prepared dinner that night, Marissa watched from the kitchen doorway, seeing not just a father but a strategist, a man who had endured insult, betrayal, and fear and transformed it into preparation. Roast chicken in the oven, 12 plates laid meticulously. The house lit softly, the atmosphere deliberate, everything pointed toward a moment that would define justice, clarity, and consequence. Evan's charm, polished in every public appearance, had begun to crack under the weight of unpaid debts, forged documents, and the patient, unyielding strategy of someone who had never surrendered. Lydia's brittle composure, her carefully constructed social mask, was similarly fraying, visible in quiet gestures, her eyes avoiding mine at charity events, her hands trembling slightly over coffee cups. The Golden family was no longer seamless. Cracks had formed, and I had positioned myself perfectly to exploit them, not with malice but with justice. By the end of 2021's early winter, the stage was set. Evan, so confident in his charm, so reliant on status, would soon learn that preparation, law, and patience outweigh arrogance, wealth, and entitlement. I closed the folder, the papers crisp under my hands, and felt a rare calm. The Craytons believed the storm had passed. They had no idea the quiet before the counterstrike had stretched years, gathering proof, strategy, and inevitability into a single decisive moment. I looked at the beams, the floorboards, the oak that had witnessed decades of my life. The house wasn't just a shelter. It was a testament, a vault of memory, proof, and law. The Crayton's golden image would fracture under the weight of truth, and I would be ready, calm, deliberate, and unassailable. December 22nd, 2021. The house glowed under strings of white lights, the kind I had hung with my own hands years ago when Marissa first returned from college. 12 plates were laid meticulously on the table, the roast chicken in the oven releasing a golden aroma that filled the space like a silent signal. Every fork, every glass, every candle was in place. Deliberate, calculated. This was the stage, and I was ready to direct the scene with evidence, law, and inevitability as my actors. Evan arrived precisely at 7 p.m. Polished and confident, the man used to winning, to charm, to entitlement. His tie was perfect, his smile carefully measured. He believed he was walking into a home he could intimidate, manipulate, or buy. He didn't yet know the perimeter had been secured, the documents cataloged, the strategy set in motion for years. Lydia's eyes, however, were already speaking to me. They told the story of a woman who understood the inevitable that her son would not succeed. Not because of luck, not because of her intervention, but because I had prepared meticulously. Marissa lingered in the entryway, torn but present, the child of both worlds witnessing the father she had learned to trust over the years against the polished man who had sought to seduce her loyalty. At 7:05, the process server arrived. I watched from the doorway as Evan's confident smile faltered slightly while he accepted the temporary restraining order and summons. Maggie stood just behind him, composed, the silent blade of authority and evidence. Lydia's fork made a delicate clink against her plate, the sound sharp, echoing, almost ceremonial. The room held its breath. I slid a folder across the table, careful, deliberate. On top lay the 1991 deed, followed by the irrevocable trust transfer, the forged bridge loan application, bank slips, Frank's investigative notes, and Maggie's affidavit drafts. The weight of decades of preparation lay there, tangible, irrefutable, undeniable. Evan's eyes flicked to each document, disbelief passing quickly, replaced by an attempt at humor. He forced a laugh, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Lydia whispered softly, "He's not bluffing." I pressed play on my phone. The audio filled the room, a brunch threat from years earlier echoing loudly and clearly. "You'll give me that house, old man." The ceiling fan hummed in accompaniment, the sound almost blending with the threat itself. Every guest froze, Marissa stiffened, and even the walls seemed to tense. Evan's mask, polished and confident, wavered. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the realization that charm, arrogance, and entitlement could not protect him against documented truth, law, and patience. I spoke then, voice calm, deliberate, unwavering. "You see these documents because they speak the truth, Evan. The deed, the trust, the forged loan. Everything you have tried to manipulate, conceal, or claim has been accounted for. Nothing is missing. Nothing is lost. And the house, this home, belongs where it always has." Evan opened his mouth, likely to protest, to charm, to attempt another bluff. But the words didn't come. He saw Maggie standing behind him, the calm authority of law and preparation, the dossier in my hand, the evidence catalogued and irrefutable. The folders on the table were more than paper. They were decades of work, love, and preparation pressed into form, a weight that could not be lifted by arrogance or entitlement. I could feel Marissa's gaze on me, tentative but resolute. She understood, finally, that this wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice, clarity, and accountability. She saw the strength it took to endure insult, betrayal, and fear while preparing, quietly, methodically, for a moment like this. And she saw that her father had never abandoned dignity for emotion, never crossed lines, never allowed impulse to replace principle. Evan's eyes flicked to Lydia. I could see recognition dawning. His mother, the woman who had once left me for wealth, who had kept secrets for decades, whose silence had allowed him to believe entitlement could trump preparation. And in that glance, the tension cracked further. Even his polished veneer showed fractures, worry, fear, and a dawning understanding that the years of underhanded maneuvering were about to collapse around him. I began to place individual documents in front of him, each one a proof of deception, each one a link in the chain of accountability. The 1991 deed first, to anchor ownership. The trust transfer next, legally binding and irrevocable. Then the forged bridge loan application, evidence of attempted manipulation. Bank slips, cross-referenced, showing debts rolling over years like hidden storms. Frank's investigative notes and Maggie's affidavits to verify every discrepancy. Each document was a silent argument, irrefutable, deliberate, prepared to withstand scrutiny. The room remained quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the occasional tick of the clock, and the low shuffle of feet as reality pressed down. Evan forced another laugh, hollow this time. He looked at me, searching for weakness, a gap in the wall I had constructed over 3 years. There wasn't one. He opened his mouth to speak again, but silence fell, not because he couldn't, but because he recognized the inevitability of consequence. I leaned back slightly, keeping my hands visible, calm. "Evan," I said softly, almost conversationally, "you thought this would be a house you could claim, a legacy you could take with words. But legacy isn't given, and it isn't stolen. It's earned, built, and protected. And this house, this home, belongs where it has always belonged." Marissa stepped forward, quietly, placing her hand briefly on mine. She didn't speak, but her presence reinforced what silence could not always convey: loyalty, understanding, and recognition that justice was patient and deliberate, not reactive. Evan's shoulders slumped slightly. Lydia's fork tapped the plate once more, almost like punctuation. The moment stretched, heavy, deliberate, the air thick with the culmination of years of preparation, observation, and meticulous strategy. Finally, Evan rose to leave, the door before him no longer just a portal, but a threshold he could not cross without facing the weight of decades of evidence, law, and deliberate patience. He had been stripped of illusion, charm, and entitlement, left to face the reality he had ignored for so long. I watched him go, the folders still on the table, the documents arranged as silently powerful as soldiers at attention. Marissa exhaled softly, relief and understanding in equal measure. Lydia's eyes lingered on the beams, the walls, the floors, the house that had withstood both time and human frailty. The first act of public confrontation was complete. Justice had been delivered quietly, deliberately, and irreversibly. That night, as I closed the door and walked through the empty halls, the roast chicken long consumed, the candles burned down, I reflected on the power of patience. Silence, preparation, and undeniable evidence had carried the day. Charm, entitlement, and arrogance could not withstand the weight of proof, and in that quiet, deliberate victory I felt something I hadn't in decades. The balance of justice restored, the house secure, and the legacy preserved. That night, after the confrontation, the house was quieter than it had ever been. The aftermath wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like the first tremor before a landslide. Marissa packed her bag in her room, the rustle of clothes and the faint clink of her jewelry echoing through the halls. She moved deliberately, not in anger, not in defiance, but in understanding. She had watched the battle unfold, observed the evidence, seen the strategy, and now she was choosing clarity over loyalty to illusion. Lydia remained at the table long after everyone else had left. Her hands rested on the wooden surface, knuckles pale, fingers brushing the papers I had laid out earlier: the 1991 deed, the trust transfer, the forged bridge loan application, bank slips and affidavits. She didn't move them, didn't fold them. She just stared at the beams above, the walls she had once abandoned, the house she had once considered collateral in her pursuit of wealth. For the first time she saw it all as it had always been. Mine. By New Year's Eve, the forged loan had been flagged. The broker who had facilitated the document was under investigation. Frank's report and Maggie's affidavit had been submitted to the solicitor's office. The machinery of law was moving, quiet but relentless. Evan's public persona, polished and confident, had nowhere to hide. He appeared composed in photographs, smiling at charity events, nodding to neighbors, yet beneath the veneer cracks were spreading. His control was unraveling, and he knew it. Marissa came to me that evening, her eyes still lingering on the staircase where she had learned to walk. "Dad," she said softly, hesitant, Do you think he'll ever recover from this? I considered her words carefully. Recovery, I said, is different from consequence. One is earned, one is unavoidable when deception is exposed. She nodded, the weight of understanding settling over her like a blanket. She was beginning to see that patience, preparation, and evidence are stronger than charm, money, or entitlement. The house seemed to breathe differently now. Floors that had once echoed with laughter now held silence, deliberate and deliberate as if acknowledging that justice had been served. The walls absorbed the tension, the triumph, the lessons learned over 3 years. Even the oak tree in the yard, gnarled and sturdy, seemed to watch over us, a silent witness to endurance and resolve. Evan's attempts to charm, manipulate, and intimidate had failed. The documents, the affidavits, the meticulously catalogued evidence, all worked quietly in the background, irreversibly. His public mask did not crack in a moment of fury or outburst. It shattered slowly, unnoticed by most, but painfully clear to those who understood the stakes. The Crayton family, golden in appearance, had fractured under the weight of truth. I sat in the kitchen that night, reviewing the ledger once more. Every bank slip, every receipt, every document was in place. Copies for Maggie, originals in the safe, investigative notes from Frank, everything cross-referenced and accounted for. The house, my home, my legacy was secure. I could feel the presence of preparation, the quiet proof that strategy and patience are more powerful than impulse or entitlement. Lydia finally spoke, her voice barely audible. I never realized I thought I was protecting him. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Silence was enough. 30 years ago, she had chosen wealth over me. Today, she had watched her son falter where he believed power and charm would suffice. Her silence finally mirrored the consequences of her choices. The rain tapped the roof outside, gentle, persistent, a lullaby for a household now settling into a new order. It wasn't the loud release of triumph. It was the soft echo of endurance, strategy, and inevitable justice. The storm had passed, leaving behind clarity, calm, and the subtle satisfaction that comes from righting a wrong without raising a hand in anger. Marissa returned to her room after a long pause, her steps light but confident. She had seen the full spectrum of human flaws and strength in one night. The arrogance of her future father-in-law, the fragility of her grandmother's silence, and the quiet, deliberate power of a man who had protected what mattered most. She had learned the weight of patience, of evidence, and of unwavering resolve. By the end of that week, I walked the halls alone, touching the wooden beams, tracing the floors that had carried our family's history. The house was more than shelter. It was testament, proof, and sanctuary. Each document filed, each lock changed, each investigative note cataloged had transformed potential chaos into certainty. Evan's golden facade had fractured. Lydia's regret had surfaced, and Marissa's clarity had grown. The Crayton's perfect mask had shattered, not with a shout or a scene, but with deliberate, patient, and undeniable evidence. The house, my legacy, and our shared history stood intact. And as I moved through the quiet rooms, I realized that preparation, law, and patience had achieved what anger never could: the restoration of order, clarity, and justice. By the time I lit the last candle in the living room that Sunday night, I felt an unusual calm. The rain had stopped. The wind had softened. The house absorbed the silence, the lessons, and the victory quietly, as it had always absorbed life itself. And in that silence, I found peace. January 2022. Courtroom 4B. The light was unforgiving, streaming through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny witnesses. It illuminated everything. Evan standing at the defendant's table, hands trembling slightly, suit perfectly pressed but powerless against the weight of evidence. The room smelled of varnish, coffee, and nervous anticipation. Maggie's testimony was precise, calm, unshakable. She detailed the trust, the deed, the forged loan, and the carefully preserved bank slips. Frank's investigative evidence corroborated every discrepancy. Every signature, every date, every document laid bare the deception that Evan had thought invisible. I spoke last. My voice didn't rise. It carried authority instead. I described the timeline. Wedding insult October 2018. Trust transfer March 2019. Discovery of forged loan April 2019, and presented the evidence in the order that made its story undeniable. The judge, methodical and focused, reviewed the documents, the affidavits, and the recordings. Evan's hands clenched on the table. I saw the moment he understood charm, status, and entitlement could not outweigh law, preparation, and truth. Lydia didn't look up. Marissa sat quietly, absorbing the final proof that patience and evidence had restored what was rightly ours. When the judge granted the permanent injunction, a hush fell over the courtroom. Fraud charges followed swiftly. No fanfare, no dramatic outburst. Justice, I realized, isn't a shout. It's a signature on paper. A quiet acknowledgement that what is right cannot be taken by arrogance or greed. And in that moment, I felt the weight of years lift, the house secure, the legacy intact, and the silence that had carried me through every step finally, at last feel like peace. Weeks after the court ruling, spring light filtered through the windows as I sanded the old stair tread from 1991. Dust rose in gentle clouds, catching the sun and settling like quiet testimony. Marissa stood on the porch watching, her hands folded, a tentative shadow of the child who had once learned to walk across these floors. "Dad," she said softly, voice trembling with both hesitation and curiosity, "did I marry the wrong man?" I set the sandpaper down, brushing the dust from my hands. I didn't speak immediately, letting her gaze hold mine. She needed clarity, not a hurried answer. "You married a man," I said, finally, voice low but steady, "who didn't understand what a promise weighs, who saw charm as currency and entitlement as leverage. But you understand now what patience, preparation, and integrity look like." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but they were not of grief. They were understanding, relief, and recognition. She stepped forward, leaning against me lightly, the first real touch in weeks that felt safe, real, and grounded. Silence filled the space between us, not empty but shared, affirming. I thought about the years, the insult at the wedding, the threats, the forged documents, the meticulous preparation, the court ruling. Every step had led to this clarity, justice, and the restoration of what mattered most. For the first time in years, the quiet felt like warmth, the house, the legacy, and the daughter. I had protected all aligned, and in her eyes I saw reflection of what patience and unwavering principle could accomplish. The silence wasn't absence, it was presence, proof, and quiet triumph. Spring 2023. Charleston carried the fresh scent of new beginnings, the streets alive with gentle sunlight and the occasional hum of distant traffic. Evan pleaded, letters and calls arriving in waves, attempting to reclaim what he had lost. But the house, the trust, the deed, and every piece of evidence I had meticulously catalogued over 3 years made any claim impossible. Lydia left Charleston quietly, her presence reduced to memory and regret. The social circles she once dominated barely noticed her absence, but the echoes of her choices lingered in every corner of the house she had once tried to manipulate. Marissa began rebuilding her life with clarity and independence. She walked through the rooms with purpose, no longer haunted by confusion or divided loyalties. The lessons she had learned, the weight of promises, the strength of patience, the necessity of integrity shaped her every step. I remained, walking the halls, the floors, and the beams that had witnessed decades of toil, laughter, and resilience. The house stood tall, not merely because of bricks or timber, but because of the effort, patience, and unwavering resolve that had fortified it. Every ledger, receipt, document, and backup had played its part. Every careful preparation had contributed to this moment of quiet triumph. I paused at the table where it all began, the wedding insult. The first evidence folder, the careful planning, the strategy executed flawlessly. The silence there felt like a crown, not empty, not hollow, but heavy with purpose, victory, and the certainty that truth and preparation endure where arrogance and deceit crumble. This was what remained standing. The house, the legacy, and the quiet assurance that diligence and principle withstand the tests of time and human folly. It was a quiet morning in Charleston, the kind where sunlight glinted off the oak beams and the house seemed to exhale a sigh of relief. A knock came at the door. I opened it to a real estate agent, neatly dressed, clipboard in hand. Generous offer, he said, handing me a card with Evan's old company logo. I held it in my hand, feeling the weight of history, deceit, and preparation wrapped into that single gesture. I looked past him across the rooms that had witnessed decades of labor, laughter, and endurance. The 1991 deed, the trust documents, the forged loan, every meticulously catalogued receipt and bank slip, each had carried its weight, each had contributed to the house standing unshaken. I smiled, a quiet, private acknowledgement of the victory earned without malice, without compromise. I closed the door gently, leaving the card resting against the frame. Evan's world, his arrogance, his manipulations all had met the consequence they deserved. The house, my legacy, and my daughter's future remained untouched. The silence settled around me again, not empty, but full of purpose, patience, and proof. It started with a sentence in a room full of laughter. It ended with silence, my silence, and that's what broke them.